about to take to the stage, so I'll speak loudly so that you can hear me over that. But just before they do, you'll have noticed that there is a slight change to the original panel lineup in the programme. So we are very, very grateful for Dr. Ioana Latu for stepping in at such short notice today. We really, really appreciate you doing that. I will now hand over to Professor Ravishankar, who'll be chairing this panel for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everyone. Welcome to this. Can you hear me? Thanks. Welcome, everyone, to this panel on diversifying research. My name is Ravi. I'm Dean and Head of Queen's Business School. It was Queen's Management School until the 31st of August. So in case you're wondering which school is that, that was the previous management school. I'm delighted to welcome our panel members today, and each of them will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and we will take questions as we complete each of the speakers' 10-minute slot. We'll start with Professor Dina Belluigi. Dina is professor in the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work, and she has had previous experience of working in South Africa, and she'll talk about interesting things that was found in one of her recent studies on staff composition research, things that we should all be very concerned about. Over to you, Dina.
Thank you, and good morning. So, recognizing the university as a social institution, we may want to ask, how does the university reproduce or challenge that of its time and that which it has inherited? Today, I'll do this briefly by looking at three areas: at staff composition, at the conditions for research, and lastly, at the complexities of a specific subject of inquiry undertaken here in Northern Ireland. The contributions of our colleagues, our students, and the keynote in the earlier sessions today were underpinned by the knowledge that racial identities are learnt, not innate, and are performed through complex social processes unfolding under power relations. Intellectual power, too, is not a natural phenomenon. It is crafted through exercises of assessment and access to systems of authorization and authority. In a recent study undertaken by myself, Professor Ade, and Dr. O'Keefe, we looked at the conditions for research in the discipline of education in the UK and found that it was in a state of inequality. Analysing data from the Higher Education Statistics Agency, we found that from 2015 to 2020, racialized minorities in the discipline of education were underrepresented in access to employment and disadvantaged once employed, and that this was becoming increasingly so. The representation of those recorded as Black, Asian, and minority ethnic in senior positions was shrinking. Increases were only in teaching-only contracts, and there were larger proportions of attrition. We compared that discipline with all disciplines in UK universities and also looked at the devolved nations. So in terms of access to academic positions in Northern Ireland, broader than a single discipline, you can see that 11% of academic staff in 2020 were recorded as Black, Asian, minority ethnic, compared to a 16.5 UK average. When breaking this down further, alarm bells ring, because what we see is in opposition to the espoused commitments of our universities. The top right graph visualizes that where staff come from differ considerably. Staff recorded as white are mainly from the UK or European Union in UK universities. This is not the case with those recorded as Black, Asian, minority ethnic. Some would say, well, there's a small percentage of the population in Northern Ireland who are not racialized as white. You can see that only 1% of UK nationals are Black, Asian, minority ethnic, far below the local percentage. Most academics who are recorded as Black, Asian, minority ethnic are from outside the UK, no doubt bringing much needed plurality, but still showing that the conditions are not representative for UK nationals. Considering that less than 10% of UK academic staff have their primary nationality from the global south, nullifies any assumptions that this is about global representativeness either. To state this plainly, firstly, race equality for UK nationals is not being met in Northern Ireland universities. Secondly, For people from Northern Ireland recorded as Black, Asian, minority ethnic, current equality compliance reporting masks transparency about your access to positions to undertake academic research. And thirdly, while institutions benefit from showcasing that their research aligns to the Sustainable Development Goals commitments to the Global South, they seldom recruit academics from the Global South. And what about sex? There were considerably lower proportions of women, not racialized as white, gaining access to academic employment in Northern Ireland. The question of the access, positioning, and flourishing of females has produced considerable research in UK higher education, with well-documented successes of practice-based initiatives such as Athena Swan. However, that particular intervention has not been of equal benefit to Black, Asian, minority ethnic women, nor white working class women. So you can see that access to academic employment has racialized, gendered, and geopolitical dimensions. What about the conditions to flourish in intellectual leadership positions once one is employed? Two graphs by Zelzer. On the left, the thousands of male professors in the UK. On the right, less than half the amount of female professors with differentiations in ethnicity. The smallest number for any group of professors were Black professors. As Satish told us, only 161 out of 23,000 professors in the UK, of which there were only 45 Black female professors in 2022. That is, only 20 promotions for Black female professors in 8 years, despite all the institutional statements, the Race Equality Charter, and Black Lives Matter. Less than 6% of UK-based professors employed in 2020 had their primary nationality from the Global South. And for Northern Ireland specifically, these were the recordings for professor by ethnicity in 2020. I was a member of UKRI's External Advisory Group for Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion. This was part of the work that we commissioned, differentiated data from research funding awards in 2020. The red, yellow, and green bars represent the success rates of those who applied for research. It is shockingly low all around, and evidence-based that those white were significantly more likely to be funded. The worst, again, were the conditions for researchers racialized as Black. So few fellows awarded that their rate couldn't even be visually represented. This has huge implications for the pipeline to employment. And only 1% success rate for Black PIs, again having an adverse impact on intellectual leadership. Across these slides, you can see that the enablers of research, employment, progression, intellectual leadership, funding, remain inaccessible. How might this relate to knowledge making? In a recent study, myself and Yvonne Moynihan, in partnership with a migrant and minority ethnic think tank, looked at how universities in Northern Ireland have been responding to the changing socio-demographics of Northern Irish society. We analyzed the research outputs recorded to the research information management systems of the research-intensive universities, engaged with the authors of that research, named partners of the research, and research development officers. The study found that Northern Ireland's research-intensive universities, despite making claims of engagement and being anchor universities, are not responding to all our local populations through their research functions. Race, ethnicity, migration, and majority minority dynamics were understudied when it came to Northern Ireland's populations. Despite marked growth, at no given year were there ever as many as 25 outputs, with only 209 overall compared to over 120,000 on other subjects. What such under-responsiveness does is place the burden of knowledge-making and representation on non-academics, individuals, and groups. The few academics who produced this work operated within an undervalued area. In interviews, authors spoke about the indifference of both the academic community and policymakers, that no one wants to touch this with a barge pole. It's just not on the agenda. And that because it's forward-looking, which is quite an interesting one, because it's forward-looking, it's beyond the horizons of institutional expectations. Regardless, we saw solidarity at work. 60% of the authors were women, certainly larger than our composition at Northern Ireland universities. Lead or sole authorship by a migrant academic or an ethnic minority was at 19%, though this includes postgraduate dissertations. Co-authorship was only at 15%. But the lead was rarely a person of color, particularly not born in Northern Ireland, or a woman. Such findings raise questions about the university's role in democratizing and deracializing local knowledge production. Without change, localized knowledges and perceptions about such minoritized groups will continue to be left open to the non-historical, decontextualized, unsupported, non-factual, invented and imagined assumptions, stereotyping, othering, and homogenizing that is prevalent within Northern Ireland society of today. I focus today on outcomes. It's equality of conditions that is to be strived for, which requires systemic change, not the rehashing of statistics again and again as we're having to do, not diversity either. Social justice is not a hospice, nor a charity, nor benevolence, but an issue of resistance and redress towards equality, and in our case, academic freedom. Remember that approaches that exclude racism as a cause of disparities act to delegitimize anti-racism as part of the solution, thereby preventing actions with the potential to actually end racial injustice. Thus, as academic citizens, I believe that we must keep ourselves critical not to allow the simulation of change, the appearance of it, while such discriminatory and exclusionary outcomes continue on our watch. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. I think we'll take questions as we go along. Can I introduce Mani Narayanan next? Mani is Head of Research Development in the Research and Enterprise Directorate, and Mani has done some number crunching over the last few years, and I think he'll be very happy to share some of those insights with us.
Thanks, Ravi. So I'm bringing a bit of my Indian heritage into this talk because it's got a bit of Bollywood almost in it, in that it starts off with some slow stuff, and then some really bad things happen, but hopefully we can end on a positive, optimistic note. So EDI in Research Action Plan. So the background to this work is some of the existing policies that are there within the university. So the Equality Scheme Action Plan, the EDI policy, but there isn't really a specific EDI in research kind of policy. And there's been a growing expectation within the research community, both within Queen's and externally, to address the sector-specific challenges that we see with sector-specific solutions. And there's also a need to kind of move beyond just meeting legal requirements, which is what some of the aforementioned policies address. And this dovetails quite nicely with the external landscape. So there's been an increasing amount of focus on EDI by major UK funders. So the Wellcome Trust, the UKRI, as well as a number of other key funders have all released data in the last few years looking into their own funding portfolios, and they've seen some existing areas of inequality there in terms of representation in terms of gender, in terms of ethnic minorities, in terms of other protected characteristics. And there's a real drive and a genuine interest within the wider research community to kind of address some of these issues. So this is quite a timely piece of work. So our approach so far has been to break up research into a couple of slightly more manageable chunks, because as you know, research within a research-intensive university like Queen's, it affects virtually everything that we do. So we've broken that up into two manageable chunks. So we've looked at pre-award stuff and then moving into kind of post-award in the next couple of years. So what does pre-award and post-award mean? So pre-award is, very briefly, it's all the stuff that happens up to the point of submission of a funding idea. So this would be things like conceptualizing an idea, developing the proposal, the costings, all that stuff that happens right up to the point of submission to an external funder. Post-award is all the stuff that happens once an award is made. So once a funder approves it and we start receiving the funds and the project is implemented, that's all post-award. And that virtually touches upon every part of the university. So it's a big piece of work. So we've started on the first phase, and we've implemented an action plan, which has been informed by some of the historical data that we've collected and analyzed those for existing areas of issues. But before I show you that, what exactly do I mean by pre-award? So there's a lot of different things that happen in terms of pre-award processes within Queen's, and I'm going to just give you two examples here. So first, the first example is something called managed bid competitions. So these are basically internal sort of pre-selections that we do on behalf of external funders. So for many schemes, funders would restrict the number of applicants a university can put forward. So we need to kind of do the pre-selection, find our best candidates, identify them, and then put those people forward for submission to the actual funder. Another example of a pre-award process is a number of internal pots of funding that we have. So this would be for things like attending conferences, for travel, for seed corn funding, those kinds of things. And there's a whole bunch of other kind of pre-award processes that we looked at. Now, I won't show you all of those results kind of for the time interest, in the interest of time. But then the trends that we saw were broadly very, very similar. And they, probably to no one's surprise, they were similar trends to what the sector has seen broadly at the national level. So in terms of the funders as well as like what other universities are seeing. So it's all the things that you might typically expect in terms of lower representation, in terms of gender, with women being underrepresented, with minority ethnic people being underrepresented, people with disabilities, and pretty much like most of the protected characteristics that you might think of. So I'm going to give you just one example from our analysis, and that's from the managed bid competitions that we've looked at. And so this, I'll walk you through the graph here. So this is looking at historical data that we, over 3 years, between 2019 and 2022. So we received around 200 different applications internally, which we processed. So it's quite a robust kind of number. It's a large enough sample size. And what you see there, I'm showing you just two characteristics there, gender and ethnicity. We looked at all of them. So just with the first one, with gender. So the blue bar is the Queen's baseline populations of research staff. So as you might expect, it's about 50-50 male-female. And the orange bar is the applications we receive, and the gray bar is the successes within our own selection processes. So we see a disproportionately high number of applications coming from men, and when they do apply, they are also more likely to be successful. With female researchers, it's the other way around. So we get far fewer applications than we would expect to see normally, and when they do apply, they're less likely to be successful. Moving on to ethnicity, so it looks like the white baseline population there is about 59-60%. It's probably a bit higher than that because there's a lot of prefer not to says in that category, but the application rates are probably in line with what we expect to see, and the success rates are perhaps slightly higher than we might expect. Moving on to the BAME researcher group, so there the application rates, superficially the application rates and the success rates look all right. It looks like the success rate might be slightly lower, but this actually masks, that gray bar there, it actually masks a very important fact. Now, we don't really have sort of proper kind of intersectional data on this, but I know from just having been involved with lots of these applications myself, that gray bar there is almost exclusively, almost 100% male BAME, as in there's virtually no female BAME researchers that have kind of come through this process and been successful at the end of it. So, and we don't always have kind of large enough numbers to be looking at things like disability and, you know, people with sort of different sexual orientations and so on. But what really comes across is that intersectional candidates are probably particularly disadvantaged, and that's something we need to address. So, moving on to the actual action plan and things that we plan to do. So we have identified 4 different areas which are priorities for us. So the first one is to understand the barriers properly. So as I was saying, the data that we have, it's a bit patchy, it's inconsistent, because it wasn't really collected with EDI in mind. It was other data that we had for different things, which we kind of aggregated here and used. So we don't have a complete picture of all the issues. And we want to speak with people with actual lived experiences of these things and understand those things a bit better, so that we actually understand what the issues are in completeness. We also want to improve our communications, so we want to be able to communicate our EDI values and our aspirations much more clearly, articulate the fact that we care about these things deeply, and include those messages in our various communications. The next area for us is to embed a lot of these inclusive processes in our actual procedures. So we are currently equality screening our procedures, and we are trying to embed a whole bunch of things that we can do to make decision-making much more fair. Now, I'm really rushing through this, but the action plan is about 10 pages long, and we have a lot of very specific action points that we'll be doing, and I'll be more than happy to kind of chat about any of those things in more detail. And then the final area really is again columns, but this time sort of more externally, because we're very aware that like these challenges are not unique to Queen's. There's something that we see across the board with funders, with other universities, and it's a real opportunity here for us to kind of learn and share best practice with these places, because as I said, for a lot of these places, it's kind of new things that they're thinking about, and we're all kind of like learning together on this. So I think there's some real grounds for all of us to work together and improve things down the line. I'll stop here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mani. Can I welcome Dr. Ioana Latu from the School of Psychology. Ioana has done work on prejudices, stereotyping, and gender bias. And over to you, Ioana.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. I am a last-minute addition to the panel, so I apologize I don't have a PowerPoint, which is terrifying, not because I don't have a PowerPoint and I haven't given a talk without a PowerPoint, but I haven't given a talk without data in a long time, but hopefully it will be worth it. So just a bit of a background, I am a social psychologist, and I've done work on racial bias during my PhD at Georgia State University, and then continued working on gender bias throughout my postdoc and academic career. And when I moved from Rutgers University here 7 years ago, I realized my research fit very well with the scope of Athena Swan, which is mostly about gender. So then my research has kind of grown into this field, including several studies that we've done in the last few years trying to understand the resistance that academics have towards gender equality initiatives. And I think that kind of extends to EDI initiatives in general. So this is related to the last panel talk around resistance. So if you're curious about that, I'm happy to give you more data and resources that we've developed around those based on 6 experimental studies. But today I want to zoom out a little bit more and talk about EDI issues in research. And I've prefaced saying that I've been interested in gender, but more and more we realize how much gender interacts with other characteristics. So it's imperative that we take those into account, of course, too, from the perspective of my research. So doing this work, I've realized sort of that diversity issues are important in 3 areas when we talk about research. The first one is the composition of the research teams. I call that the who. Then the diversity issues in the content of the research, the what are we researching, what are we innovating? And then the third one is diversity issues in how we do the research, the way we do the research, the how. For example, what are kind of the participants that we engage with when we conduct the research, if we conduct research with human participants. So I'll take them one by one, and then I'll try to talk about some of the solutions to those issues. So the first, the who, is probably the most important one of the issues that I talked about. So do we have a diverse research team, diverse research institute, department, university, or even field of research? It's important, I think, for both moral reasons, right? It's the right thing to do. It's morally right to be inclusive, to include everybody. But it's also important for pragmatic reasons. There's actually quite a bit of research in social psychology and organizational psychology showing that diverse teams tend to have better outcomes. They tend to be more creative, generate more creative solutions. Sometimes they're even more productive. So it's important pragmatically and morally to have more diversity on our teams. The second is the what, and this is something I've become more and more interested in the past. There are examples from many areas of research and innovation that show that if we don't take into account diversity, there could be negative outcomes of the actual quality of our research. So I'll give you just a few examples. Some of them are sort of famous if you've been interested in this. Seatbelts is probably the most famous example of this. They were initially designed and tested for men, so they turned out to be less safe for women, costing lives, perhaps. There are apps that have been developed to initially identify melanoma, for example. They've been developed on whiter skin, so they don't work as well on darker skin. Medication, drugs, every year there are drugs being withdrawn from the market because of unknown, untested side effects that are more pronounced for women compared to men, because gender and sex were never taken into account. But it's not just about medicine. For example, city planning done without caregiving roles in mind, which are seen to be, not real work, usually done by women and minorities. And this leads to negative effects in terms of city planning. And I think one of the most interesting issues that has come up in the last few years is AI, which not only is biased, but tends to perpetuate bias because it develops algorithm based on biased information. And I don't have a PowerPoint, but if I showed you an image of a Hindu bride and a typically Western bride dressed in a white gown and all of that, AI is less likely to identify the image of a Hindu bride as bride compared to the other one, because it's developed, the algorithms were developed based on images collected from Western websites, for example, right? So it has the tendency, I think we need to pay attention to that because it tends to perpetuate the bias through its algorithms. And I think the point here is that research could save a lot of wasted effort, money, and even lives in some areas if we, from the get-go, from the beginning of the research process, take into account diversity and its effect on diverse groups. The third that I mentioned is how we do the research. And here I'll come back to psychology, which is my field, where a lot of the findings, when I started studying psychology, a lot of the findings were based on data from introductory psychology students from American and other Western universities, who tended to be white, middle-class students, right? Somebody called this weird science, weird here being an acronym for Western educated, industrialized, rich democracies, right? So we have weird science, which maybe it applies to non-weird populations, but maybe it doesn't. And I have kind of a cringe example of this. In the 70s, the psychologist Lee Ross came up with a cognitive bias called the fundamental attribution error. And this is the tendency that we attribute somebody's behavior to internal causes, versus external causes. So internal would be personality, intelligence, something like that, versus external is situational forces, right? So we say we tend to think that somebody succeeded because he's smart or he's driven, right? Rather than, maybe he had a support system or some external factors that determined his success. Well, it turns out that this is not as fundamental as we thought, because in collectivistic cultures, so more Eastern cultures, we don't see this bias as strong as in individualistic cultures. But because the data was collected in mostly American universities, we ended up calling this the fundamental attribution error. I'd be very embarrassed to have come up with that term looking back. So as I was thinking about what I was going to say today, I thought, what can I say that's new and you don't know? Because I'm sure you've kind of heard about all these things that I've talked about. And of course, I can't bring anything that new to this, but I think I want to share something that I truly believe in, and something that I've learned in the last few years doing this kind of research. And it pertains to how we address EDI issues in research. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not enough to have the right values. I think that's really important. It's not enough to believe in diversity, to be an open-minded person. Those are really important things, but they're not enough. I think what we need to do is all become accountable for addressing these issues long-term, because we'll have to keep addressing those issues. They keep coming up. And how do we do this? I think two strategies that we can use are measurement and checklists. And it sounds very pragmatic and boring, but I think they're quite important. So in terms of measurement, we need to, like Mani presented, for example, we need to keep track of diversity on our teams. Do we have a diverse team? What about our seminar speaker invitations? Do we have gender racial balance if we can? Authorship that Dina talked about too, conference participations. We need to keep measuring these and keep track and address those. And the second thing is having compulsory checklists in all the steps of our research processes. So from the design stage, to data analysis, to reporting the findings within the scientific community and community at large. So are we considering gender, race, disability, socioeconomic status when we design our research, when we decide who we collect the data from, and so on? Are we considering those factors when we analyze the data that we have? And also, are we using non-biased language when we report the findings within the community? And I think always coming back to those checklists helps us avoid biases that we're maybe not aware of, helps us take the pressure off the person and kind of just scapegoating on different people, and helps us become more accountable for what we do to ourselves, to our teams, to the research community and the community at large. For checklists, examples of checklists, I do recommend the Stand for Gender Innovations website, which has examples of those checklists when conducting research and innovation, and that's a helpful resource to start with. So along with some colleagues, we plan to address some of those issues in a project that we're thinking about. So if you are interested in those issues around research, do let me know, get in touch, and we can talk more about it, or I can share some of the findings that we have so far on the resistance to equality. That's all I have. Thank you.